Hi, welcome, and today I'm going to read for you a really good article called The Case for the Sanity of Women by Cherry Blossom Life. There is nothing wrong with me, except I was born at least 2,000 years too late. Ladies of Amazonian proportions and berserker propensities have passed quite out of vogue and have no place in this too damned civilized world. Here I sit, mad as a hatter, with nothing to do but either become madder and madder or else recover enough of my sanity to be allowed to go back to the life which drove me mad. Laura Jefferson. Early Wednesday morning, my 6-year-old daughter was running about the house, tearful and enraged, shouting through her sobs, "No, Mummy, no! I'm not going to school!" She refused to get dressed, hid in the closet, and then eventually resorted to feigning a stomachache. When I'd got her to calm down, I managed to find out what was wrong. "I don't like marching. It's boring," she replied. "Marching? We're practicing for sports day and we have to march outside for ages." "Well, yes, that does sound rather dull." "It is. It's the most boring thing in the world, and we just march and march and march." Does my daughter have psychological issues because she's unable to placidly conform to the behavior that the school expects of her? Is she suffering from being a child? In other words, is this how we expect children to behave? Or is her behavior the normal reaction of any human being who is forced to carry out a mind-numbing and clearly pointless task? And what does it mean to her to know that she must conform to gendered behavior and to understand that for 6 hours a day, while she's in school, what is acceptable behavior for boys is deemed inappropriate for her own caste, whose members must be as polite and deferential as possible at all times? When it comes to explaining away the sadness and anger of females, psychiatry has always offered the former explanation. Women were inherently crazy, so the thinking went, and treatment was focused on helping them deal with their womanness in what was considered to be a perfectly sane society. Psychiatrists and psychologists were firm in their conviction that being a woman meant that you were predisposed for madness. There was, however, one type of woman who could avoid being declared mad by the professionals. Such a woman employed a canny survival tactic, and it involved acting. If she was able to stuff herself into a little box of caricatured behavior which distorted her natural impulses, in other words, if she could perform femininity, then she fared better. Such grossly feminine women have generally been safer from witch hunts and from being locked up in mental asylums. Note, it is not the women who are gross, but the mannerisms they have been forced to adopt in order to survive. I myself do femininity these days because I found it to be an effective camouflage which helps me fly under the radar. In 2007, a famous pop singer shaved her head because she was done with being objectified. The witch hunt that followed was designed to show women what happens to those of us who step out of line. Shortly after the incident took place, her father and brother declared that she was not fit to manage her own finances and became her conservators. The judicial courts supported them, and they assumed control over all facets of her life, including her professional life, as she was deemed psychologically unfit. In other words, they forced her back into femininity and pocketed her earnings. She lost custody of her children. In April 2012, her manager, who had recently become her fiancé, asked to be her co-conservator, meaning that he will have legal control over several facets of her life. Non-feminine behavior in females has always been regarded as a pathology, and because all but the most broken and brainwashed women exhibit non-feminine behavior in some form or another, it has led to countless women being hospitalized, drugged, lobotomized, restrained, and so forth in psychiatric hospitals. By femininity, I am of course referring to heterosexuality, saintly motherhood, not talking back to your husband, not having the audacity to believe you're a human being, repressing your creative energy, not refusing sex with your unattractive husband, keeping your hair long, wearing makeup, finding fulfillment in cleaning the toilet, and a myriad of other oppressive behavioral traits imposed upon women by society in order that they fit into the little slots that patriarchy has designed for them. When radical feminist women such as Phyllis Chesler entered the field of psychiatry, they were horrified at what they found, and at what they didn't find. After taking advanced degrees in the subject, Chesler realized that she had learned nothing about how to ease a person's suffering. Over the course of the past 30 years, women have painstakingly overhauled the entire profession, but not without facing fierce resistance from the old boys. Just imagine that for a long time men wanted nothing to change, refusing to listen to female psychiatrists who insisted that everything had to change. The fact that women in the field have had to fight against their male superiors for psychiatry to become a more humane profession tells us that it has never been about helping people, but about controlling women. Both the records of the perpetrators and witness testimonies substantiate this view. Laura: in the beginning, I wasn't shrewd at all. I was just so hurt. Laughter: I didn't know that they would punish me 3 times as much if I tried to escape. They put me in a straitjacket, and this was rather cruel, and kept me alone in the room for 24 hours. I could hardly move, and I was completely stiff. They wouldn't even let me go to the bathroom. They put a bedpan under me and things like that. From Women and Madness by Phyllis Chesler, Ph.D. Close quote. When men took it upon themselves to build enormous castle-esque, soul-destroying buildings of stone with the intention of incarcerating countless women who could be raped, tortured, electrocuted, lobotomized, experimented on, half-drowned, locked in solitary confinement, restrained to the bed, and drugged unnecessarily, we can only assume that they had been built for this exact purpose: to perpetrate acts of political torture against an oppressed and politically disenfranchised group. Standing symbolically just on the outskirts of town, with their high walls, gloomy stone facades, iron gates, and cheerless windows, the grotesque architecture of mental hospitals also served another very specific purpose. It sent a foreboding message to all women who dared to refuse the prescribed gender roles of happy housewife, happy hooker, or happy factory hand. I believe that in every woman's subconscious there lingers dreaded unsaids. You want to be careful, or the men in the white coats will come for you. Phyllis Chesler describes her dismay in her book, Women and Madness. Quote, much of what we take for granted today was not even whispered about 50 years ago. During the 50s and 60s, clinicians were still being taught that women suffer from penis envy, are morally inferior to men, innately masochistic, dependent, passive, heterosexual, and monogamous. We also learned that it was mothers, not fathers' genetic predispositions, accidents, and/or poverty who cause neurosis and psychosis. None of my professors ever said that women or men were oppressed, or that oppression is traumatizing, especially when those who suffer are blamed for their own misery and diagnostically pathologized. No one ever taught me how to administer a test for mental health, only for mental illness. I still think of this as a psychiatric imperialism. I knew that what I was being taught was neither useful nor true. I began analyzing mental illness statistics about the relevant academic studies. I read historical accounts of women's lives. I located the stories of European women who had been condemned as witches, including Joan of Arc, and from the 16th century on, psychiatrically imprisoned. In the 19th and 20th centuries, in both Europe and North America, a man had the legal right to lock his perfectly sane wife or daughter away in a mental asylum, and some did. Authoritarian, violent, drunken, and/or insane husbands had their wives psychiatrically imprisoned, sometimes forever, as a way of punishing them for being too uppity, and in order to marry other women. Whether the woman patient was entirely sane, or whether she had experienced postpartum or other depression, heard voices, or was hysterically paralyzed, whether she was well-educated and well-to-do, or an illiterate member of the working poor, whether she had led a relatively privileged life, or had been repeatedly raped or abused in other ways, whether she accepted she can no longer cope with her narrow social role, whether she had been idle for too long, or had worked too hard for too long and was fatigued beyond measure, she was not treated with any kindness or medical expertise. Many women of the asylum did not survive the brutal beatings, the near drownings, the force feedings, the body restraints, the long periods in their own filth and in solitary confinement, the absence of kindness or reason, all of which passed for treatment. From Phyllis Chesler's Ph.D., Women and Madness. Close quote. As I sifted through the literature on what men have done to women in the name of psychiatry, A strong, insistent hunch crept up on me, which I eventually could not ignore. Never had it been more clear to me that their professional incompetence could no longer be swept under the carpet. I believe we have no alternative but to recognize that any man who has become a medical professional, particularly in the fields of psychiatry and gynecology, must be presumed incompetent until proven otherwise. Given the ample historical data available to back this conclusion, it would be irresponsible of us not to do so. Of all the appalling atrocities I came across as I researched the article, there were a few that loomed large in all their patriarchal glory. I've assembled 8 pieces of information that I've decided to call the 8 absurdities. I've chosen the word absurd because of the ludicrous rationalizations that men have used in order to justify the maniacal treatments they designed and implemented in order to cure women of being human. Insane human beings who believed that they were sane, men, had the power to treat sane human beings who were told they were insane, women. We must ensure that such an Orwellian situation, whereby sanity is insanity and insanity is sanity, is never repeated. Absurdity number 1. Being oppressed is a mental illness. In patriarchal societies, incest, rape, and family violence are endemic. Women are economically disenfranchised, and statistics show that they are poorer than men by far. However, psychiatrists believe that whenever a human response to severe violence or to emotional or material deprivation manifested in women, it was a sign of pathology. In other words, if a rape victim remained happy, upbeat, and generally okay, she would have ticked all the boxes of mentally healthy. Whereas if she showed signs of trauma, PTSD, insomnia, flashbacks, and so forth, she would have been treated for madness. Or if a woman who had children to feed was unable to make ends meet because the very fact that she had children prevented her from working and tried to end her despair by attempting suicide, she would be classified as mad, and in many cases still is. Nobody would have helped her with her cooking and laundry. Nobody would have paid for her heating. Nobody would have removed her abusive spouse from the home, if she had one. And nobody would have offered her childcare so that she could find a job, were there any job available to her. When it came to women and non-Caucasian males, psychiatrists maintained that their life circumstances were irrelevant to the symptoms they manifested. Naturally, I find this completely absurd. Absurdity number 2. Convicted rapists and pedophiles have access to female patients. Women admitted to mental asylums are often raped by male members of the staff and by male patients. How many women never report their rapes, we will never know. Often the reason the women are there in the first place is because they're suffering from the psychological repercussions of rape, either rape in childhood or at the hands of their current spouse. These traumatized women are sometimes diagnosed as having borderline personality disorder, when in fact the correct diagnosis is torture victim. Women are more likely to be raped in state custody than anywhere else, and each time they are raped, it heaps trauma upon trauma upon trauma. If they report it, they are usually disbelieved. Despite the fact that women in psychiatric institutions are a free-for-all for rapists, consensual love or sexual activity between 2 female patients has traditionally been punished, a situation I find utterly, laughably absurd. Absurdity number 3. Bearing a child out of wedlock or in wedlock is a mental illness. Women who had quote-unquote illegitimate babies were locked away in mental hospitals by their fathers, sometimes for life. Other women with legitimate babies were locked away in mental hospitals by their husbands, sometimes for life. As a radical feminist, I find the concept of legitimacy and illegitimacy inherently absurd and do not recognize a distinction. All children are legitimate by virtue of the fact their mother gave birth to them, so it is particularly unnerving to realize that these man-made, completely arbitrary categories were used as a premise to incarcerate women. All of the women received aggressive treatment at the hands of psychiatric doctors. Quote, Laura, the first thing they did was give everyone shock treatment. It didn't matter who you were. You walked in and they give you shock 3 times a week. Before they decided what ward they were going to put you in, they shocked you completely. I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die. The only person who came to see me, and this is going to make you laugh a little bit, came to give me an IQ test. Close quote from Women and Madness, page 193. Many of the women were beaten. They were denied contact with the outside world. They were forced into unpaid, sex-typed labor, such as domestics and laundresses. If they refused these jobs, they were considered crazy and uncooperative and severely punished. But if they did the jobs well, the hospital staff would be unwilling to let them go. A veritable witch's dunking. Absurdity number 4. Sex between patients and therapists. In the 1950s and 1960s, a number of leading psychoanalysts married their most beautiful patients. Plenty more had casual sex with their patients. Nobody thought there was anything wrong with this at the time. Today, feminist analysis explains how this is a serious boundary violation and breach of power. There are now hundreds of studies and books documenting this phenomenon. Most of these sexual contacts took place between middle-aged male therapists and younger female patients. Even in cases where the women managed to articulate the boundary violation, they usually did not sue for fear of being disbelieved in court. After all, many were being treated for paranoid tendencies. The entire farce can be summed up by one documented case. Quote, one therapist suggested to his female patient that sexual contact might increase her transferential involvement with him. When she finally refused to pay for such treatment and began seeing another therapist, the first therapist told her he would continue seeing her for sex and would not charge her for it, but wouldn't listen to her, quote, problems, quote, any longer. Close quote from Women and Madness. Now that feminists have highlighted the damage that male therapists can cause to female clients, the onus is on the field of psychiatry to prove that there are any upsides to a woman being treated by a man. I suspect there are none. Absurdity number 5. Women who fight back against their rapists or violent husbands are mentally ill. Self-explanatory. Women who have fought back against their rapists and batterers find themselves in jail or in mental institutions for daring to save their own lives. Chesler reminds us that these brave, unbroken women are political prisoners who should be honored by feminists. Absurdity number 6. Sexology. Sexologists have earned a reputation for being advanced, progressive, and open-minded. They have been lauded for attacking Puritan, Victorian, uptight sexual mores and for their discovery that women experience sexual urges of their own. They are seen as pioneers for the right of women to experience sexual pleasure. Upon closer inspection, however, we find that they have only ever supported patriarchally mandated sexuality, such as BDSM practices, especially the concept that women are innately masochistic, monogamy within marriage, and the sexual liberation of unattached women. In cases where women's sexuality did not serve men in some way, sexologists have traditionally stepped in to lure them back onto the path of righteousness. In The Spinster and Her Enemies, Sheila Jeffreys explains that sexology is inimical to women's liberation, and she references a number of famous sexologists such as Walter Heap. Quote, he was worried that marriage seemed to be out of fashion and looked forward to a time in the future when marriage would become more attractive to celibates. The solution to man-hating was to overcome women's dislike of sex and to ensure that they were married. Several of his later works were devoted to sex education and particularly solving the problem, as he saw it, of female frigidity. Close quote. Lesbians, married women who refused to have sex with their husbands, and single celibate women who focused their energy on something more interesting than men were hit hardest by the sexuality meddlers. Moreover, the fact that it took until the end of the 19th century for the phenomenon of the female sex drive to be discovered tells us more about men and their incompetence in the bedroom than it does anything about women. Absurdity number 7. The second wave of psychosurgery coincided with the second wave of feminism. Out of all 8 pillars, this is where we should focus our attention the most. Psychosurgery involves mutilating healthy brain tissues with the aim of apparently changing the person's behavior. It is not generally used on psychopathic serial killers and rapists, always male, as you might expect, but rather on unhappy women. During the 1970s, women's unhappiness and rage culminated in an upsurge of feminist consciousness. Mary Daly wrote at the time, quote, "The current wave of psychosurgery is aimed not only at state hospital patients, but especially at relatively well-functioning neurotics, particularly women." On February 24, 1972, Dr. Bregan's article, "The Return of the Lobotomy and Psychosurgery," was read to the Congressional Record. Discussing the remarkably large proportion of women who are being lobotomized, Dr. Bregan explains that it is more socially acceptable to lobotomize women because creativity, which the operation totally destroys, in this society, an expendable quality in women. A famous psychosurgeon, Freeman, the dean of lobotomists, is quoted as saying that lobotomized women make good housekeepers. Concerning this phenomenon, Dr. Barbara Roberts, a feminist, observes that psychosocial conditioning is no longer as effective as it once was in suppressing female anger. Quote, "But ever resourceful, patriarchal class society is developing what could prove to be the final solution to the woman problem and the problems caused by all other oppressed groups. That weapon is psychosurgery." Close quote. The weapons that modern technology is developing for social control of deviants, particularly women, are more subtle than burning at the stake. They merely destroy minds, the capacity for creativity, imagination, and rebellion, while leaving hands and uteruses intact to perform the services of manual work and breeding. Close quote. From Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father. I think you'll agree with me that by now we've left the realms of simple male insanity and absurdity and have entered loony, loop, la-la, man-loon land. Absurdity number 8. The diagnostic criteria of personality disorders. A more recent absurdity I came across was the fact that when people are unable to cope with life, or if they exhibit certain behaviors, they are told they must have a personality disorder. Personality disorders are included in the Diagnostic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Quote, "Those diagnosed with a personality disorder may experience difficulties in cognition, emotiveness, interpersonal functioning, or control of impulses. In general, personality disorders are diagnosed in 40 to 60% of psychiatric patients, which is the most frequent of all psychiatric diagnoses." Close quote. What is interesting about the diagnostic criteria of personality disorders is how well they can be used to uphold the patriarchal status quo. For example, research shows that males are more likely to have narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, than females. But when you look at the symptoms of NPD, there is immediate cause for suspicion. Quote, "Narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by a long-standing pattern of grandiosity, either in fantasy or actual behavior, an overwhelming need for admiration, and usually a complete lack of empathy towards others." Close quote. Where I come from, this is what was known as NBD, nasty bastard disorder. And if a woman suspected that her sister or friend was in a relationship with a man showing symptoms of NBD, she would strongly advise her to leave him. Today, the docs may diagnose him with NPD, guilt-tripping his significant other into staying with him. Similarly, histrionic personality disorder apparently manifests more in women than in men. It is described thus, quote, "A personality disorder characterized by a pattern of excessive emotionality and attention-seeking, including an excessive need for approval and inappropriately seductive behavior, usually beginning in early adulthood. These individuals are lively, dramatic, vivacious, enthusiastic, and flirtatious. HPD affects 4 times as many women as men." Close quote. I find it unreasonable that psychologists have invented a symptom called inappropriately seductive behavior in order to label women, when we live in a society that teaches women that their sexuality is the entire sum of their worth. It is especially strange when you factor in that prostitutes, and to a lesser extent wives, are obligated to display seductive behavior even when they feel no natural inclination to, because that is what men demand of them. Perhaps the energy of psychiatrists would be better spent worrying about the psychic toll of being forced to pretend you fancy your clients, and being forced to fake enjoyment of sex over and over again, rather than about women who have decided, for whatever reason, to behave seductively of their own volition, Or perhaps they could read a book on rape trauma in order to learn that women sometimes act out after they've been attacked. In sum, the diagnostic criteria of personality disorders seems to excuse men's bad behavior while pathologizing women's trauma. The fact that excessive emotionality can still be legitimately regarded as a symptom of mental illness, existing in a vacuum outside of any political context, tells us that here in 2012, psychiatry is still up to its old tricks. Now, if you'd like, I can read some of the comments to you, because sometimes the comments on these articles are just as good as the articles themselves. 43 responses to The Case for the Sanity of Women. Bedelia Bloody Knuckle says, beautifully done. I absolutely sympathize with Britney Spears and still do. There was also a time when autistic women were institutionalized. Wouldn't be surprised if it still happens. And when I was diagnosed, I was under the threat of being institutionalized too. If my mother didn't fight for me, even though she is a patriarchy worshiper of the worst kind. Lindsay says, Women and Madness is a wonderful book, easily one of my favorite feminist texts. Also, has everyone here seen this article? And she links to an article. It's a modern article written in 2006 with survivors' stories mostly dating from the 80s and 90s. It describes shock treatments being used to make women more docile, often at their husband's behest. I had known things like that happened earlier, like in the 1800s with lunatic asylum imprisonment, or in the mid-20th century with psychosurgery and early electroshock, but I had no idea it was still being done in my lifetime. Is still being done, probably. Cherry Blossom Life says, thank you, Bedelia. I'm glad your mother was able to overcome the patriarchal brainwashing to the extent that she understood that there was something very wrong about people coming to lock up her daughter. Many mothers are too far gone and are the perfect handmaidens doing the patriarchy's job of despising their daughters. Lindsay, it is an excellent book, isn't it? I ordered it specifically for researching the series and was blown away by the fact that Chesler has actually written from a radical feminist perspective, rather than just simply describing the atrocities. Thanks for the link to the article. And yes, I'm sure this sort of thing still goes on all over the place. Catherine Orion says, fantastic post. My personal favorite, meaning the one I find most hilariously absurd, psychiatric disorder is parental alienation syndrome, which is applied to children involved in custody cases. Supposedly, the child suffering this disorder is severely hostile towards one parent, invariably the abusive father, though they don't say that, of course, because of indoctrination by the other parent, the mother, and the treatment for this disorder is separation from the parent doing the indoctrination, i.e., the kid gets forced into living with the abusive father rather than the mother who is trying to get herself and her children away from the abuse. It seems that this particular disorder is so insane that it's not officially recognized by any psychiatric body of note, but I get the impression that it, or a similar idea, is nonetheless fairly influential in psychiatry and custody disputes, which is not great. Cherry Blossom Life says, yes, parental alienation syndrome equals evil mother syndrome, invented and legitimized by patriarchy. But they know if they called it by its real name, it would raise a few eyebrows, so they decided to give it a more neutral-sounding name. And yes, evil mother syndrome has become a thing recently, and men have been using this crackpot diagnosis to control women in the divorce courts. Parental alienation syndrome is clearly a case of men projecting their own behavior onto women. Plenty of fathers groom children to despise their mothers, both directly by undermining her and manipulating the kids, or indirectly by modeling contempt towards women in general. And too many mothers go out of their way to defend abusive fathers. How many kids have heard the phrase, he's still your father, when their mother is defending some abuse meted out by him? One reason women defend husbands is because they've got nowhere to go and are worried that if they divorce him and he gets custody, he will have free rein to abuse them. At least if she stays with him, she can rein it in a bit. Bug Brennan says, quote, non-feminine behavior in females has always been regarded as a pathology, quote. Yep, great post. Parallel Existence says, great post, Cherry Blossom Life, sets it out all so clearly. Those old Victorian asylums always have such a creepy vibe about them too. Kathy says, they are still trying to drug us into docility, Lindsay. People do that to children who are hard to manage, and husbands still want to control wives by sending us to shrinks, forcing us into submission. I feared my husband would toss me into an institution. Fortunately, he seemed to need me for child rearing. Maggie says, awesome work, Cherry. I understand your daughter. School definitely teaches gendered behaviors and is another patriarchal institution that teaches girls to conform to feminine roles. That's why so many tomboy girls are ostracized. I was a tomboy when I was a kid, and I was ostracized by many female schoolmates. Not their fault. School is one of the first institutions that divide females from other females. Though most little girls have great female friends during school years, they're also taught to look down on other females. Patriarchy is already at work there. Femininity is a patriarchal behavior of ritualized submission. Women can get punished or deemed crazy when we don't conform to it. That's why men and male-identified women constantly portray us radfems as a bunch of loonies. Well, it's in fact the whole patriarchal system that is insanity. Women-identified women are the only sane people in all this mess. I love Phyllis Chesler's work. She's debunked so many patriarchal myths about women. Male sexual violence against women and men's pedophilia on girls are pandemic. This is scary. How can those guys claim that women are crazy when they are already the ones doing crazy, cruel things to women and girls? The bastards. Quote, despite the fact that women in psychiatric institutions are a free-for-all for rapists, consensual love or sexual activity between two female patients has traditionally been punished, a situation I find utterly laughably absurd, close quote. Men's erasure of lesbianism again, sigh. Psychology and psychiatry are traditionally patriarchal fields. It is crucial to refuse to accept all the women-hating lies coming from those male medicalized institutions. They also prescribe Valium to so many women to keep them passive, the fuckers. Any female retaliation against patriarchy systems of male dominance is deemed crazy. This is so absurd, but patriarchy does not make much sense, I guess. Cherry Blossom Life says, thanks, Maggie. Patriarchy constantly contradicts itself. It's like they don't even care anymore that there is no consistency to their reasoning. Trans is another good example where, at first, men used this or that justification for riding roughshod over us, but now they've reached the point where they know their arguments don't make sense and they simply don't care. All they say now is, look, women, we're the ruling class, so suck it up. Same goes for how they treat women in psychiatry. Facts tell us that men are insane, dangerously insane, and yet it's women that are getting locked up. Yisheng Kinghua says, grew up witnessing my father beating the shit out of my mother. He never really abused me, only my mom and my older sister. He died when I was 12. I knew it was going to get way worse for me after that. All the hatred and resentment from my father was transferred to me. I was institutionalized for over 5 years. Abused until I didn't want to live anymore. Tried to die at 14. Ended up in a mental hospital and diagnosed with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, ADHD. Put on lithium and Prozac, shuffled into one abusive foster home after another, and ended up in St. Rose Treatment Center for Girls for the last 2 years of my minority status. Upon turning 18, I was released back home to an abusive mother and older sister. My mother tried to tell me I needed a man to take care of me. Uh-huh. Like my dad took care of her? No thanks. My whole life has been one long series of abusers. The abuse is still happening. Men 10 years my junior patronize me. Male doctors cut me and destroy my body. Male, quote, friends, quote, threaten me and try to control me. I care less and less whether I live or die anymore. This post resonated with me, and now I'm crying. I suppose it's good to have some catharsis. Sorry about the rant. I feel 1,000 years old, and I am tired and so angry. I have nothing left. Cherry Blossom Life says, I'm so sorry, Yisheng. It doesn't get much worse than that when you've described. To read your usually upbeat and downright hilarious comments, I would have never guessed in a million years. All the woman hatred in the world lands on the heads of daughters, doesn't it? Either one daughter in a family or all of them. Daughters are the ultimate scapegoats for a mother's rage. It's so sad. It's really worth reading about how it used to be before they did this to us, about Demeter and her 4 daughters. Chesler begins her book by describing these goddess myths and the ancient bond between mother and daughter, showing us what it was like for us before it all got broken and destroyed. Kathy Blue Jazz says, Yisheng Kinghua, I'm sorry also. Your comments add so much to the discussions. I'm a fan of yours. I don't know how we're supposed to heal when the psychiatric professions are so patriarchal. Davina Squirrel says, excellent post, Cherry Blossom Life. Poor Brittany. She was under extreme control, mainly by males, since her mid or early teens, and the hair shaving incident was her declaration of independence and assertion of her own personhood. Unfortunately for her, the males around her tightened the reins even more. She is in her late 20s now. She is an adult. She should be able to control her own life and get the males out of her life for good. The level of control over her by her father and that partner dude is unreal. Throwing off displays of femininity becomes easier as you get older. The most pressure is directed towards younger women and girls during the period which patriarchy deems prime, the prime reproductive years, and given the invisibility of women over 40 to 50, so that young women won't listen to them. It makes it easier not to display the ritualized submission of femininity. Maybe that is how the life begins at 40 expression came about. Women waking up to the game that was going on and becoming their own persons? Of course, if you try to buck the system before your invisibility cloak kicks in, you're likely to be punished in some way. I adore my invisibility cloak, so much more freedom and independence, and I have been so much calmer and happier since becoming a separatist. Patriarchy is an oppressive regime for females. Yi Sheng Qinghua says, agreed. I will only see a female psychiatrist and psychologist, but I think the most healing thing would be to live in a nice, safe place with only women. They wouldn't have to do much, just be there. I'd love to build things and work where I live. That would be neat. It's so tiring having to pretend that some men never abused me because I am dependent on them for my survival. It does make me feel crazy. FCM says, applying male-centric concepts of mental health to women is just so insane. It's hard to even find the language to express how insane this is. Thinking about it deeply enough to write about it is exhausting and crazy-making, but the resulting work is profound, like Chesler's book, and like this post. Absurd is a good word. If men hear voices, either internally or externally, telling them that they are bad or repulsive or whatever, they are clearly imagining or hallucinating it. But are women? This actually is what women are being told every day they are alive, but to acknowledge that would be to acknowledge patriarchy. But that is the one thing that is never acknowledged by any male or any professional for that matter, perhaps especially doctors and lawyers. If men experience debilitating anxiety upon leaving the house, there is probably really something wrong with them. There's no reason for it, no objective reason, why one man would experience this any more than any other, similarly situated man. It's subjective, or pathology. For women, if we recognize reality and how much we are hated and that we are targets for sexualized violence, why would we ever want to leave anywhere we felt relatively safe? Similarly, if men can't hold jobs, or if they fail to thrive in this world that men created to benefit themselves, a completely stacked deck, it's very often because they are losers or mentally ill. If women can't, it very well might be because we cannot and will not conform to the ritualized submission required of us on top of the standard requirements of our labor and professional competence. Or because we complain when our male co-workers use our computers to look at porn, thereby making ourselves a problem. For this kind of thing, we create our reputations as troublemakers and bad sports, which follows us across the industry. These things destroy women's lives and careers, and our sanity. The cause and effect of mental illness and job insecurity are reversed in women and men, aren't they? Mentally ill men can't hold jobs. Women are often driven insane by the working conditions and sexual harassment, and constant objectification and extra and often contradictory requirements which are impossible to fulfill, like being ball-busting and dick-sucking at the same time, or competent yet deferential. The injustice and insanity of men and patriarchy is too much to bear many times, and this not being able to bear it is treated medically or psychiatrically, that is, with more injustice and male insanity. Perhaps women slipping into the background at times to get away is the only thing that prevents us, all of us, from swinging from the trees, and yes, acting keeps us off the radar. Shulamith Firestone's Airless Spaces mentions more than once that some women are just grateful to have a bed and a place to crash. They relish the asylums for that reason. With all the horrors awaiting them there, it is actually better than what they have as free women on the outside, even if it just means being able to sleep or to use the hibernation as an escape. One woman said that if only she had her own TV and phone, she would voluntarily stay there forever. I'm not sure all the stories in Airless Spaces are true, but if you read them, you get the feeling that they are. It's just very obviously an insider's perspective and reads like, you can't make this shit up. Very interesting too that once you've been in or in and out of hospital, no one believes you anymore, if they ever did. All this information, first-hand accounts of the reality of asylums, especially for women, is very conveniently lost. Cherry Blossom Life says, LOL, I had to laugh at a completely stacked deck. Yes, men can get jobs just for being men. Good jobs, I mean, not humiliating jobs or horse labor jobs. Every time they walk into a room at work, all that is judged is their competence. Not their competence plus age plus sexiness plus subservience / feistiness, or whatever expression of sexuality is more desirable in women in that particular workplace. And yet some of them still can't manage to keep it together. FCM says, also, surely the current economic crisis and high unemployment for women will mean that women no longer have access to psychiatric care. So I wonder what this means for us all. If we don't have health insurance, no one is going to voluntarily treat us for free. That could be a good thing, perhaps in the longer run. The situation is the same for gynecology and obstetrics too. Of course, Sandra Fluke illustrated the problems for women not having access to prescription contraceptives, but we all know that already, too well. What else does it mean for us? If we are no longer able to access various medical treatments, knowing how misogynistic and harmful many or most or all of them are to women specifically, how will this change things, or will it? People are already starting to accept that the world has drastically changed now, and that there is a sharing economy developing out of necessity. In response to the crisis, men have destroyed their world. Has patriarchy cracked a bit? Like weeds, will women's reality and culture start growing in the cracks? I hope so. Cherry Blossom Life says, well, I think that women are far more psychologically prepared for this new world than men are. It is practically ingrained in our DNA that we have to grab whatever job we can, that we have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, that we have to be resourceful. For men who have had everything handed to them on a plate, this new order is going to come as a bit of a shock. Hence the Occupy movement. I do believe we may see a crack or two. Men are hopefully going to have to pour more energy into surviving than they have before, which means they'll automatically have less energy for oppressing. In Japan, men used to be guaranteed a lifetime job, the lifetime employment idea. They couldn't be sacked. Women, of course, were shunted into crappy jobs with a cement ceiling. However, nowadays companies simply can't afford men, so all the contract and temporary work is being taken up by women. Because A, they will work for less, and B, they have no pride to swallow. What is happening is that many men are living like women have had to in the past, i.e. in substandard accommodation. And many will never marry because they can't afford a wife. Because at the end of the day, why would a woman marry a man she has to support just so he can lord it over her and get her running around after him doing the cooking and cleaning? Not worth it. Less husbands around equals less wives equals less women being accused of insanity. FCM says, yes, all of that is true. I'm talking about access to medical care, though, including psychiatric care. This aspect of the current crisis will not have the same meaning for people living with socialized medicine, so I should clarify that a bit. Here in the US, we don't have socialized medicine. It's either welfare if you qualify, or pay to play, either with cash or credit or insurance. That means that for many of us, our health coverage has been lost with our jobs, and for better or worse, if you cannot afford care, or if you don't qualify for benefits, you will not be treated. If you break your leg, they will still set it for you and bill you later. Emergency care will still be provided even if the bills bankrupt you, but if it's not an emergency, you're on your own. There will be many obvious downsides to that, but there is an upside as well, especially for women. I think the answer is obviously there will be an upside. Medicine, one of the big 3 of the patriarchal institutions, has lost part of its grip on us, hasn't it? Of course, many psych treatments and the cost-benefit analysis around them presume that you are going to kill yourself if you don't get care. They frame it as an emergency or emergency-like. That's how the gruesome side effects of psych treatments, up to and including causes death, are justified. But is that a true emergency of the kind they will treat you for free in this new economy, even if they don't get paid? I don't think so. Psych emergencies are seen in the emergency departments, not doctors' offices, where there is a break from reality or often violence. Are psychiatrists and psychologists still going to pretend to think everyone is suicidal if no one has any money or insurance to pay for anything? Where is trannyism going to be if none of it is paid for anymore, and the docs aren't willing to lie anymore about all gender dysphoria patients being suicide risks? It makes you think. Of course, Obamacare might swoop in and get women back under that thumb, and getting contraceptive coverage, among other things, might make that outcome preferable even, but it's already happened. Some women have been without insurance for several years by now. Even if that changes in the future, some women who were under the thumb have already experienced being out from under it. I wonder what the effects of that will be, and what that has already set in motion. Cherry Blossom Life says, yes, the system is different there. The NHS/government has always lost money through people getting sick, whereas in other countries, hospitals actually get money from people being sick. Having said that, it has never stopped the NHS from sectioning women in mental asylums unnecessarily. Anyway, you're right that the bar of what constitutes mental illness is going to be held much higher if nobody can cough up the cash for treatment. And where is trannyism going to be is a very good point, especially because I read somewhere that taking hormones and mutilating your body doesn't even lessen the incidences of suicide among people who believe they're trans. FCM says, I should add that the docs lie about the risks of suicide as well as the risk of self-mutilation in the case of trannyism. The patients lie too. But in any event, will the small risk of self-harm constitute a true emergency in this new economy either? I don't know, but considering the greed of medical providers and the motivation for the transsexual empire, in the first place, money, I kind of doubt it. As you say, though, there isn't a lot that will ever stop men from harming women, including institutionalizing us. So who knows if any of this will turn out for us. The world has changed, but women's reality has a funny way of staying the same. Double Vez says, hello Bedelia and Cherry. Thank you for this provocative essay. Almost all women are institutionalized eventually if they live long enough. We call them elder care centers and other euphemisms. I am in the midst of daily visits to provide a friend with what cannot be provided by the care center, which has rock bottom funding, overworked and underpaid and unskilled staff from other countries who don't speak English. Try that with your elderly aunt who has failing vision and hearing. I don't know if they are modeled on mental hospitals or vice versa. The women are 4 and 6 to a room, have no stimulation, and are being used as guinea pigs for every lightly studied but heavily marketed useless preventative drug. There are 180 residents with minor dementia, which I believe is caused by the drugs, but don't mind me. There are 4 males in that number, so this is essentially how we treat the women who built our country. Sorry if this is off topic. Thanks always for your provocative writing, Cherry Blossom Life. FCM says, yes, that's a good point, isn't it? Dworkin's expose of the condition of elderly women in the U.S. in her book, Right-Wing Women, was profound. It changed the way I think about our situation. I think I realized how bad it was for the first time and exactly where this road we are on leads. This femininity road, this fuckability road, this het partnership road all leads to nursing homes if we live long enough, being drugged and raped by the orderlies. Cherry Blossom Life says, thanks, Double Vez. Laughing out loud at don't mind me. Japan's nursing homes are full of old women, not old men, so they each nurse a husband to the end of his life and then there's nobody to nurse them. Double Vez says, I'm practical, so I have a practical request. Phone a nursing home, care center, whatever, in your area and ask if they have any women residents who get no visitors. They will likely say yes, quite a few. Go through the interview for volunteers if that's required and get in there. It's not all awful, especially when someone takes your hand and whispers, thank you for coming. Sing, play an instrument, help feed, give a hand massage, and talk about your children or the country they are from. And be prepared to do the same thing next time because it does help them then, and also that the staff know someone cares about this woman. Bring a few candies, a picture book, brush her hair. Just 1 hour, once a week if that's all you can manage. Please. Karmara DK says, thank you for that, Double Vez, and thanks, Cherry, for the excellent article. Double Vez, especially for those of us who have lost their mothers, these elders are very like our mothers. When I go to a nursing home to visit a friend, it is almost impossible not to engage with others who would gain so much from friendly touch and a little of our strength. So many feel confused and frightened or have small needs the staff does not have time to attend to. Some just need someone to push their chair outside to take in a little sun once in a while. Some just need to be called by their names by a person who is not a paid caregiver. It isn't awful at all. It is a deepening and satisfying experience. Thanks for bringing that up. Let me add that it is very true that having an outsider look in on a woman who is otherwise alone is a protection for her. Double Vez. Hi, Karmarat. And if you speak another language, ask about women residents who have no one who understands them. My last visit, there was a woman singing and talking out very loudly in Punjabi. None of the staff knew what she was saying. She may have wanted or needed something, been in pain. They are old women, the most useless thing of all to the patriarchy. This organization serves all of Canada. They are all volunteers and are frequently threatened with lawsuits by the College of Physicians and Surgeons. The founder has put all her assets into family members' names, so there is nothing for the doctors, facilities, medical professional unions to get. Even her car, which she uses to go from center to center. Karmarad says, Double Vez, I read the article. I thought nothing could shock me about our situation anymore. Reports of shooting wives in their knees so they can't escape in Guatemala. The acid attacks and nose mutilations in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The frightful mass rapes in the Congo. But this happens right here in developed countries to the absolutely most vulnerable among us, and this instance is of a savagery I can hardly stand to read about. And she's referring to an article the other person posted. Feminist Theory says, I will appreciate your articles as it covers a lot of things related to women. Though all these problems you have shared in your articles still exists, I will say what are the remedies or what actions we can take so that we can cope up with the situations that are worst for women. We can't change the total scenario, but we can cope up with the situations for a good cause for women. Feminist 101 says, I actually have a post on my blog which makes a pretty darn good case for the sanity of women, feminists especially. Anna says, Lindsay, the link you posted truly horrified me. I read the whole article and then I looked at the Wikipedia article about electroshock therapy. I was surprised how positive it made electroshock therapy seem. I am not a frequent Wikipedia contributor and I don't really dare to start editing that article, but I would really love to see it changed. I think it should reflect the negative side effects, intentions, and outcomes of electroshock therapy. I think the article you linked to provides good information and references for editing the Wikipedia article. Anyone interested in and able to change that article? And that is the last comment. Thank you for listening, and hey, maybe I'll check out that article sometime.